Hello everybody, welcome. It's a breezy day in the garden, so there may be a little bit of mic noise. One would imagine that I could get some kind of a buffer, right, and just put it on the mic that would filter out the wind, and maybe I can. Haven't had that idea much before just now. I have two topics on my mind. And we'll see, how things work out in terms of covering them relatively well, because they're both very deep topics. I was a child in the 1960s and 70s, and I was a young adult in the 1980s. This gives you some idea of my age. I mention this because I grew up in a very different milieu, in a very different world from the world that we exist in today. Same planet, radically different human lexicons, concerns. And by lexicons, I mean the features of our experience that we make language about, and the specific concerns that create the linguistic maps we use to communicate about these matters and to formalize them in thought and speech and writing. And in my youth, the prospect of space travel was prevalent. I watched on television the first moon landing, maybe sometime around age 4 or 5. Was fascinated by space and science, astronomy, biology. Particularly dinosaurs. I also was exposed to the science fiction of the time through movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, Silent Running, which was a film about the humans having so destroyed the Earth that they had to keep the remaining ecologies in domes orbiting, I think, Jupiter. Let's see, what other important films were there? Obviously, I saw Star Wars, but that was much later. Star Trek was a primary source of science fiction ideas and adventures. And it was really, in the beginning, a sort of bold experiment, the idea behind which had something to do with, let's have Westerns in space. Right? I was also exposed to books like, I probably read Chariots of the Gods by von Daniken when I was maybe 7, and was fascinated with the idea of non-human intelligences and UFOs, and also over time, as I got older, I became interested in the broad periphery of anomalism, and humans. It seemed to me that there were cracks in the edifice of modern human thought, belief, models of identity, and so on. We're going to get a little wind here for a minute. and that the study of anomalies, things that didn't fit in to our linguistic paradigms, our semantic paradigms, our scientific paradigms, seem to be a wonderful garden to explore in. So I grew up not merely fascinated with UFOs and anomalism long before this was a popular topic. I think it was probably in the 90s that a broad array of sort of cult-like, there were precursors in the 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, but it was really in the 90s that we started to see, for example, the little icons of, grays or whatever. And films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out and influenced popular and personal ideation, thought, concern. So I lived deeply fascinated and curious about these things. And not merely curious, it was certainly my hope that somehow one day I might meet beings from another world, or another dimension, or another universe, or all three. Certainly, the popular science fiction of the time, the broad portion of it posed UFOs as spaceships from other planets. So that's the category that naturally occurs to people who have a fairly simplistic way of thinking about and categorizing such phenomenon. At this late date, I'm now in my late 50s. I've spent thousands of hours studying reports of anomalies and UFOs. There's a great, very thick book that doesn't really spend time proposing theories, but just simply, it's called the UFO Evidence. It's just reports, right? It's just transcriptions of reports. And the problem isn't that there's no evidence of non-humans traveling to Earth in some way, whether that is a technology or not. In other words, whether the vehicle is primarily mechanical or it has some other quality, or it may even have a selective absence of physical qualities that allows it to, for example, make a right angle turn at 2,500 miles per hour or whatever. So it's not that there's a lack of evidence, unless by evidence we mean physical materials, possibly bodies or actual beings, whether they are fully organic, partly organic, whatever their status may be. The common people, we don't know whether or not there are objects associated with this phenomena in the possession of governments. But in terms of sightings, direct personal experiences, often with groups, often involving people of very sober mind, there are tens of thousands of reports of anomalous phenomena in the air. Now, The problem isn't that there's no evidence, it's that the humans have not developed an array of scientific abilities that would easily allow us access to correlate, sift, and explore the evidence that presently exists in the form of reports. And the reason that I'm talking about this today is that some friends of mine recently reached out to me in a chat that we share and asked me what I thought about David Grusch, a whistleblower, or at least a so-called whistleblower, who had security clearance in the federal government and is making claims that he has been told. So this is already, at least one claim removed from any kind of actual experience, that the United States government is in possession of physical artifacts, possibly craft, maybe bodies, from non-humans that have either crashed or landed on Earth. And that, of course, they've been keeping this from the American people. And in listening today to some journalists talking about Grusch, I was of many different minds. As long as one can say, I can't produce the evidence because it's classified, or I produced the evidence to Congress that was producible legally, then there's no need for any evidence, right? As long as one can shuffle off the responsibility of providing actual evidence for one's claims, whether you shuffle this off by just saying sources that wish not to be named, or you say it's classified, we can't discuss it, but I'm aware of it, that's not evidentiary speech, right? There's no evidence there. You've got one person making a claim that other people made claims. So what? Is my first response. Whether it's likely that there might be some special branch of the government in the United States, I'm speaking of, that deals directly with reports of downed craft, retrieval operations, and so on. That seems quite likely, that there is at least the provision for an organized response in the event of a crash or report. And it's also fairly clear that if such an organization exists, and it probably does, it would have a ridiculously high clearance, security clearance requirement for all kinds of reasons. And there are a vast array of important reasons not to reveal to the public anything about this. There are a number of people who seem to be persuaded that someday our government will make a big disclosure. We've been in contact with aliens all along. We couldn't tell you, it was too dangerous. Now we're coming clean. There's actually other beings in time-space. They're clearly visiting the Earth. There's probably a number of different ones with different agendas and so on. This is profoundly unlikely. One of the reasons it's unlikely is that it would destabilize the delicate authorization networks, which are mostly malignant processes and malware that run our societies. Yeah. So any revelation of non-humans capable of space travel, or time travel, or dimensional travel, or all three, would fundamentally undermine the delicate networks of malware authorizations that our societies run on. No one is going to do that. Individuals might have a go at it, but no organization within the government would ever be likely to do anything resembling that, because it's too psychologically dangerous for the relatively poorly educated slave people and the wealthy to cope with psychologically, relationally, psychically, right, in the psyche. It would present immediately, face to face, the idea that not only are humans not the most intelligent species around, which is blatantly obvious if you look at species on Earth, but there are others that are vastly more intelligent and capable, and probably vastly older than us. And so this would create the problem of an alternate authority. Everyone would need to know and want to know, well, what are they saying? What are they doing? Have they tried to teach us things? Why aren't they teaching us? What's going on? What do they think of humans? What do they think of our societies, our machines, our so on, right? If in fact they think in ways that resemble how we think, which is not particularly likely. So there's a sort of blockade, right, a buffer between whatever the government, quote unquote, has awareness of. But, the government isn't a person. It doesn't do things like what people do, right? It's a system. And it's a system of nested systems. Most of those systems have been captured and run basically just straight malware, right? If we tried to run our computers the way we ran our governments and societies, they would burn their processors up in the first iteration of trying to run an instruction, right? It would be blatantly obvious to us that this is garbage, yeah? And it's pretty obvious to many of us that we don't have anything resembling an intelligent society, or a society intelligent enough to know what not to do. Our educational systems are, in some ways, worse than education that we might have received in the 50s or 60s. And in other ways, they are overwhelmed by little sub-branches of specialization. And particularly technological specialization. So unlikely the government's ever going to come forward and say, we've been in contact with aliens. The uproar in the public would have to become a crisis, right? And it would damage our social systems, our business systems, in a way by giving the lie to them, yeah? It would have the potential to demonstrate blatantly that most of what we're doing as humans at the group level, qua the species, is lethally misguided. And nobody wants that because you don't have a job tomorrow, right? The country collapses into chaos. Yeah? So unlikely that there will suddenly be some big disclosure. Not impossible. Individuals might have the power to some degree to force that. I find David Grusch relatively unconvincing personally. I will be entirely happy if I turn out to be wrong about that or have misread it, right? Now, the problem, again, isn't that there's no evidence of non-human intelligence on Earth. In fact, anyone who's deeply familiar with nature is viscerally aware that we live moment to moment in a manifold of non-human intelligences, and whether or not they come from Earth isn't even the point. It turns out that on a more careful examination, there's nowhere to come from but space. So the Earth-centric perspective that humans are trained in is not only wrong, it has a modest useful scope, right? We don't want to throw it away. But the actual facts that are obvious is that every form of life here is actually a mode of space-time. It makes a specific kind of living space in time, and relationally, it makes all kinds of different modes of time, temporalities. We could call these organismal temporalities. Beings from space are certainly aware of this. Yeah, there's beings who came to Earth from other worlds, dimensions, and so on would this would be preschool knowledge to them, right? So the humans are really weirded out about, well, if there's intelligences coming here from somewhere else, that could be really dangerous. Possibly, but I mean, there's weirder questions. If we don't get help from intelligences from somewhere else, we are the most dangerous intelligence that we will probably ever encounter. If any kind of alien civilization or something had any plots or plans involving dominating humans or destroying them, it would be over in an instant, right? More likely, they are aware of the symbiotic networks of intelligences throughout time-space. They may even use those networks to travel with, as in the kind of comic book but interesting example from Star Trek Discovery where they use a feature of the mycelial network to travel through space-time. Mycelial. There may be organic transports in space-time, and when I say maybe, I actually don't believe that. I believe there absolutely are organic transports in space-time, and that it's possible for humans to hitchhike on them. I also suspect we don't need physical vehicles at all to travel. The universe, the way that it is strangely self-intimate, right, allows for all kinds of different forms of travel that don't require physical movement, don't require vehicles, and so on. So in the case where organisms or beings are actually using physical vehicles or something resembling that, and more than likely what you'd have there is something like a metamaterial, something that isn't actually there. Okay, in the same way that water flows till you freeze it, right? You could have a vehicle that could dissolve into the transports in space-time and then begin the process of physical formation at a distance, right, say on another world, and then go through phase state changes until at some point it's mostly physical. And very likely highly advanced planetary civilizations would eventually discover this. But the ancients and indigenous people were well aware. You know, there's lots of stories about, did the UFOs help us build pyramids and so on. I think this is kind of comical. UFOs cross billions of miles of space-time to help humans pile rocks up. Doesn't make a great, it makes a good comic book, but not a good science fiction story. More than likely, they were simply aware that there are non-human intelligences accessible to human consciousness in space-time. And some of those intelligences may occasionally be physical. Now, in terms of the reports, you know, it's a pie chart, right? It's a manifold you have to collapse. Some of the reports are psychological problems. Some of them are misidentifications. Some of them are pure anomalies. Some portion of them are very likely to represent the subject of concern if our concern is, what are these phenomena in our skies that often act like vehicles, occasionally emit beings that humans have encounters with. What's the ontological status of these phenomena? And again, it's a broad spectrum of phenomena. The problem, once more, is not so much that there's no evidence. I guess if 12 people say they saw a house fire, more than likely they'll be believed. They will certainly be believed if they can take a listener to the place where a house burned down. In this case, often what we have are leftovers. We have problems with the vegetation at the site of a purported encounter, anomalous EM readings, burns and radiation effects on some of the people, psychological effects. But there's a lot of evidence. There's mountains of reports from people who've had these experiences. The problem is we don't really have a paradigm within which, as a species, we can intelligently examine and sift the evidence and formulate at least theories, right? And I would argue that governments are the wrong organ of contact between humans and non-humans, right? In nature, nothing in nature is going to try to contact governments. It's almost like governments are the opposite of beings, or even something like demons, or the absence of beings. So, on the one hand, governments are the wrong organ for contact. On the other hand, wild-eyed humans are probably the wrong organ for contact too. And I think it's true, if other intelligences exist, they would select specific humans or groups. It would seem any intelligent person would do so. You or I would do so, even if we were just looking for help with something, right? We would vet the responders, and we would select responses that seemed sound and safe and helpful, right? So one would imagine that if there are such beings, and I think there are, they would probably select individual humans with whom to have contact. There are so many problems here, though. And the first problem is that our lexicons don't really contain the categories or tags that would be important and useful to disambiguate these phenomena. In other words, our lexicons are missing key ideas, models of time-space, of organism, of consciousness, of reality, that would allow us to work with the data intelligently. Whatever portion of these phenomena could possibly be people from another planet in a spaceship, and that's probably a small portion, that's about the only model we have, right? I mean, that's the only... there are exceptions, right, in the community of people who study this, people like Jacques Vallée and so forth. It long ago became obvious to me in studying this phenomena that it's very unlikely that these phenomena represent objects and processes that are common to our existing lexicons of ideas, models, maps, what reality is, and so on. More than likely, much of this phenomena is somehow related to the nature of consciousness itself and the kind of light that awareness not only emits into our experience, but also is reflected back to us. It's very common for people to believe something that is sensible to believe, which is that if three people are sitting at a location in the desert together at night watching the sky, they will see exactly the same thing that any other people at that same location, at that same time, right? Take like three pairs of three, or a triad of groups of three observers, okay? And just imagine A, B, and C are at this location, at this time, at night, watching the sky. Now take them away and put D, E, F there. They have an experience. Take them away, put G, H, I there, right? G, H, I, three people. It is natural to believe that each of those groups of three people would have the same experience. That is a rational belief. It's a sensible belief. It's not true. Experience modulates according to who is participating and why. It's very possible that ABC could have experiences of phenomena that DEF have no experience of. None. They're in the same place, they do not see the same thing. Now, will they all see the basic features of the sky, like there's the moon at that angle? Yeah, probably, right? But that's not the extent of the catalog of phenomena. That's one layer of phenomena. And there are many layers that are not accessible to rational thought. Some of those layers do have something to do with disorganized consciousness, mental illness, psychosis, paranoia, schizophrenia, so on. Certainly, what we bring to awareness, our purposes, our histories, our concerns, our curiosity, our playfulness, our hopes, our dreams, our fears, all of these things play into our experience. So the idea that there is objective experience is not entirely false, but there are no objective experiencers. The only things, even machines, they're not objective experiencers. Humans built those, right? So the category of this phenomena should be very carefully sifted and organized in thought if we are to make any progress toward understanding. Otherwise, what we're going to do is just play out the categories of, you know, the familiar milieu of our lexicons, current state of our science and technology, and so on. It was long ago obvious to me that it's not likely that the objects that we see are in a collapsed physical state. They appear to be in a state, many of them, that is not merely physical and has, in some ways, some kind of a resemblance to transcendental phenomena, right? Phenomena that includes extra dimensionality or has something to do with the divine. So I'm sitting here in the shade and I'm getting assaulted by mosquitoes. So for example, if you could put, let's say you had a craft and the craft has qualities inside it that allow it to dissolve, let's say to become, for the purposes of ease of use, right? Let's say you have a craft that can achieve, it can dissolve into the quantum layer and then reformulate itself elsewhere. But it doesn't have to fully reformulate itself. If you were to put a craft in a superposition so that the beings inside it inherit the superposition without damage to their biology, presuming they're organic beings, then you could literally just scroll through time-space, space and time, right? And that might cause appearances local to the positions in space-time you're scrolling to, right? Earth, circa 1957. That might cause distortions in space-time that would produce very bizarre effects in the physical layer and the human minds and animals that encounter these phenomena. But there would be no need for actual travel, right? If you could achieve a superposition inside a vehicle, you can just scroll through space-time. You could build an interface. Scroll through space-time and then partially or completely collapse into physicality at any location in any time, possibly even in a number of locations simultaneously. This is the key weird feature of a technology like this, right? You could partially collapse in 7 different locations and times, and unless you completely collapse to one, you'll always have the remnant of a superposition to play with. Now this is just a model, but it's a model that allows us to see that the ways that we commonly think about these things are naive and very primitive, probably, compared to what we're actually looking at or looking for. I still find the topic fascinating. It's much harder to explore carefully these days because it's muddled with cults, disinformation, misinformation, personalities, and so on. There's a vast field of participants in human information systems that are not only untrustworthy, many of them are effectively malignant because their goal isn't understanding, it is capturing human attention or manipulating human attention. So when we think about the UFO question, we have to include myth, right? The history of the mythic awareness of humans over hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. The psyche, right? the delicate interiority, the sort of structure of mirrored gazes within us with which we negotiate our own identity and experience, cognition, the problems of language and lexicons, semantic systems, their goals and purposes, governments, religions, psyops, right? The attempt to capture or manipulate, the intentional attempts to capture and manipulate human lives, human minds, human attention, human thought, right? By systems that are largely malignant where they are not overtly so. And then we would have to consider the psychological perspective. These topics are highly psychologically charged, more so for people with an unstable basis of consciousness. Then we would consider perhaps the people who are just getting it wrong. There's something going on, but they misidentify it. And then finally we get to the actual phenomena, right? The non-ordinary itself, as is truly accessible to us as human beings. And for most of us, once the 90s started happening, we started having reports like those from Whitley Strieber, a brilliant writer, about alien abduction phenomena. And this is a sort of liminal phenomena, right? It's in the between of ordinary consciousness and other states. And in a sense, the whole topic of anomalism and UFOs is a liminal topic, right? It's in the borderlands of the reality we're ordinarily familiar with. So we started having a variety of new branches appear on the tree of both anomalism itself and the topic of UFOs, aliens, quote unquote, etc. I mean, I sort of have the opposite of the opposite opinion of everyone else. I think everything comes from spacetime. Seems pretty obvious to me. So there aren't any aliens. All of the intelligences in time-space comprise a single family. The humans think there are aliens because the humans are alienated from nature. The humans are projecting their own alienation from the vast living library of intelligences right here on Earth that are blatantly contactable. They're reflecting that alienation when they look to the sky, right? And they think, oh, well, the aliens. Right? Meaning, people, but not our kind of people. But the Earth is filled with peoples that aren't our kind of people. The bee people, the raccoon people, the sage plant people, the oregano people, the ants, the bees, the wasps, the dolphins, the whales, the octopi, the squids, all kinds of peoples here. They're just not technological peoples, and most of them are not formally representational peoples. In the film, I think it was Contact, we see a more interesting sort of perspective on the meeting, like the first meeting between humans and non-human intelligences in a scientific container, right? We build a ship to do this. They send us plans. We assemble the ship. Christians attack the ship and damage it. Jodie Foster goes to another universe, perhaps, and is waiting on a seashore, and the appearance of a man comes and speaks with her. and in a welcoming and gentle communal way. Okay. Some of us have had direct experiences with seeing anomalous phenomena in the sky. I wonder how many, if any, of my listeners might say that they had direct experience of contact with non-human beings, right? Advanced, right? Not regular animals and so on. That would ordinarily be thought of as the pilots or crew and so on of a vehicle. This experience is relatively uncommon, but again, there are at least, I'm sure there's a few tens of thousands of reports of this happening. And while some of those reports might be invented, it is catastrophically unlikely that they all are. Some of those reports might be experiences of extreme mental disability or destabilization. Very unlikely that they all are. This is a world in space-time. It would probably be interesting to spacefaring cultures, and they might even be very concerned about it because our world could have a function in a network of worlds that the humans are unaware of and are damaging. It's certainly true that living worlds play a role in the enrichment of space-time. That role may be vastly more important than anything humans have ever considered, including religion. So there's lots of reasons why, if there were space-time faring beings, that they might be interested in Earth, and maybe even specifically, at least a little bit, in the humans. I don't know what will come of David Grusch. I will be very surprised if anything unexpected comes from that. It would also be almost impossible to trust anything that comes from it, right? You see, every nation on Earth has a vested interest in having other nations believe that it is in possession of technology developed by non-humans. And that need creates a psyop problem and a disambiguation problem where you can't tell the difference between signal and noise. Most of our modern culture and media is largely noise at this point. It's as if over the past, say, 25 years particularly, the entire ocean of information has transformed toward a kind of malignant, malware-like, infinitely self-reproducing process that just, the whole goal is to get engagement, right? Share it. This is because of advertising, money, governments, and religions. These four things. The governments are certainly experimenting on their own populations, and where the governments aren't doing that directly, the corporations are doing it for them, and the governments can easily make use of what they can learn just from studying what the corporations get away with and how that's done. So there's a lot of big questions here. The question of first contact is probably moot because first contact happened a long, long time ago. What we would mean by that now is a reliable contact with non-human intelligences in our time, right? That became, let's be really clear about something. There's one staggering problem with almost all of the reports of contact with actual beings. And the problem is this. If I meet a raccoon, right, and I form a relationship, let's say, with a raccoon that's wild, when we come together, there's a transfer of knowledge, of intelligence, of sensitivity. It's as if our two peoples are meeting through me and this raccoon. Yeah. And so there's always evidence of a transfer of knowledge. I would be able to teach someone things I learned from watching a raccoon. As an example, one day a friend brought his little dog Hado to my house. Of course, this is a domesticated animal. And Hado was absolutely glued to the window. Just absolutely glued to the window. And the window's on the second story. There's nothing out that window to see. You can't see like the sidewalk or anything. It's up in the air. The only thing that's out that window is like a tree branch. And eventually it hit me, and it hit me like a catastrophic insight, that Hado's mind was suffocating in the dead stillness of the inside of a box in which nothing is moving. He was holding on to the fluttering movements of the branches in the wind like a diver holds on to oxygen, right? Like when you take, like a solo diver holds on to oxygen, right? And it had never occurred to me before that my house was dead inside until with Hado, right? I suddenly clicked. Why is he watching? What's out that window? There's nothing out there. It's just branches moving in the... Oh my God. There's nothing moving in here, right? There's nothing alive in here. It's dead air inside this box. So that's an example of transfer. And in the vast array of reports that I've encountered, there's nearly never transfer of knowledge between the humans and the non-humans that the reports illustrate the interactions of. I find this quite bizarre. Occasionally, there is some. But it's extremely suspicious that the meetings between humans and, we'll just call them space people for now, don't contain more actual teaching, right? Like, what do you tell your people? You can't tear the ecologies apart, right? This message has come through. Nuclear bombs, bad idea, right? Like, this message has come through, I think. I believe there was a situation in Africa where there was contact between what appeared to be a craft, some beings in the craft, and a group of school children. And they did seem to talk to the school children, which is very interesting, right? Because clearly they could have selected a group of adults to make contact with. If they're going to land in the field of a schoolyard, they must have chosen to do so, right? They must have chosen the children to speak with. But overall, there's a suspicious lack of transfer of knowledge and information between humans and non-human beings that we believe to be non-terrestrial. It may turn out that the idea of non-terrestrial is itself wrong. There's probably a more important idea. For example, if all the living worlds in time and space, right, are networked together and exchanging information, which I believe they are, the idea of terrestrial life is kind of a misnomer, yeah? This is all space life. all of the evolutionary processes on Earth are probably informed and inherit qualities and potentials from other living worlds in time-space, and if not from other living worlds, certainly from time-space itself, even if there's no network of living worlds, which seems to me wildly unlikely. So everything here is time-spacey, yeah? It's almost like the humans decided our world is separate from space-time. This is the world where the humans are the dominant, important thing. And so any of that other stuff is alien. That's a pretty weird idea to start out with. Our ancestral peoples, the ancient peoples and indigenous peoples, they knew something about the sky. And they thought of it like an ocean, and some of them apparently thought of the Earth like an island in the ocean. That means other islands. That means one ocean. That means everybody's together, right? We all come from the same waters. The topic is infinitely deep. I'm still very interested, and I think it would be amazing if our species actually made contact with another advanced, intelligent species that was capable either of travel or transubstantiation, something like this. The problem is we've never formed a society intelligently oriented enough to form a good organ of contact to invite beginning that relationship. And even if we did form such an assembly of minds and people, the whole civilization is running malware, so how are we going to deal with that problem, right? The problem of information about intelligences from other universes or worlds most likely will destroy the malware that we're running and calling societies. And so our societies are not going to inject themselves with the antidote to themselves, right? It's not going to happen anytime soon. Many more questions and ideas to think about. I just wanted to briefly touch on these topics today. I'm really grateful for all of you who joined me and listened to me. And I wish you wonder, learning, play, beautiful relationships, amazing dreaming, and much love. Bye-bye for now.